Hello, welcome everyone. Delighted that you could join us here for the talk, The Indigenous Rights Declaration from Policy to Practice with Khelsilem. So I want to welcome all of you who are watching on the live stream as well. I wanted to begin by recognizing that we're on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. My parents come from what is today Pakistan, and my father was born before partition, my mother after, and via India they immigrated to Canada. And with all these entangled colonial histories, it's really important to not just recognize the past of colonial histories, but their present, and how to make those changes today regarding the rights of Indigenous people, and particularly working at a post-secondary institution and also with arts and cultural organizations in the city as well, the importance of continuing to do that important work. It's wonderful to have you all here in person and all of you online as well for this discussion. After I introduce Khelsilem, he'll speak for a while and give his talk. We'll be in discussion for about 10 or 15 minutes, and we'll open it up to questions. And immediately following that, there will be a reception in the World Arts Center, which is located on the second floor here. Khelsilem is an Indigenous leader and current chairperson of the Squamish Nation, first elected to council in 2017. He was the official spokesperson, active in leading work on various projects initiative, including developing an affordable housing not-for-profit that's building 1,000 units of subsidized affordable homes and 6,000 market apartment developments at the Sinnock lands. He's sat on numerous boards, including Vancity Credit Union. I first met Khelsilem when he was an artist and activist and still a teenager, so wonderful to see all of the wonderful, amazing things that he's been working on. So please join me in welcoming Khelsilem.
I'm just going to get situated here. Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? Are people dry? It's very wet outside. I'll just begin by briefly introducing myself in my language, just to say, Tinoyap ansukwet toltit seats, Nelta ans Khelsilem, Tinat Intla, Squamish Ochomeoch, Chinwa Amot Natla Ealshin Tate seats, with Quinsnach Sequas, what Amot Nata Humalston, et Aslahan, La Squamish. Anslight Quins Quinman Eoch Swat, Quisn Tlap no Mot Tate seats. Just wanted to address everybody and share a greeting in the language, and to briefly introduce myself as Khelsilem. Khelsilem's an ancestral name that was given to me by my late grandmother a number of years ago, and it was a name that belonged to her great-grandfather. It was handed down in a ceremony to me. I carry a few other names as well, but Khelsilem's the easiest one to pronounce, so that's the one I go by for general audiences. But I also now live in a place that we call Ealshin, which is basically at the foot of, near or close to Denman and Davie, otherwise known as English Bay. But I grew up in two Squamish communities called Humalston and Aslahan, which are located on the north shore of Vancouver. But I've been a proud resident of the city of Vancouver for about 10 years now. And then in addition to that, I identify as Squamish as well as Kwakwakkiwak. My paternal family is mostly Squamish, and then my maternal family is a mixture of Squamish and Kwakwakkiwak ancestry, mostly from Alert Bay, Guilford Island, Fort Rupert, on the northern tip of Vancouver Island, from the Scow and Brochi families, and then from the Baker and Rivers families on my father's side, Squamish side. So tonight is an honor to be able to have you all come and be here, and for those that are either watching online right now or watching the video later on. This talk really came as a conversation with myself and Am, and also really the opportunity to think about and talk about some of the work that has happened over the last 6 years, but also sharing, I think, the insights and ideas that could help propel this work towards advancing Indigenous rights within more institutions and within more spaces, and ultimately, I think, to the goal of Indigenous rights, which I hope to talk about a bit more tonight as well. And I'm also very grateful that each and every one of you are here to participate and listen to this. It's been a while since I've given any kind of talk or lecture of this kind. I'm often doing conferences or talks, if I am doing them, mostly talking about the Sanok development or real estate or housing, which I love talking about. And if anybody knows me, knows I love talking about housing, as does pretty much everybody in Vancouver, as I understand it. So it's nice to have a break from that and to talk about something else that's also near and dear to my heart, that I've had the fortunate opportunity to really grapple with, not just the theoretical and the conceptual, but also how to translate that into the practical and the material. And I hope tonight is very informative or useful and insightful and can be used in a very practical way for people to take with them into your lives or your work. So before we begin, however, I want to begin with an important acknowledgement. Acknowledgements are very important, as I understand it, in Vancouver. Acknowledging something can educate people who might not know something. Acknowledgements can be a way to help share a perspective. If an acknowledgement is done right, it can be felt very heartfelt by the recipient or the intended recipient of that acknowledgement. And so I could give you an example. If I was doing an acknowledgement, and let's say I had a partner that was here in the audience, and I took a moment to acknowledge my partner and say something really nice about them and how they do wonderful things for me, and that I couldn't be able to do this work without their support, which I have done before, by the way, that would be a type of acknowledgement. And it would be potentially meaningful for my partner to hear that, especially in a public venue. Maybe it is touching and heartfelt and meaningful for people to hear that. Maybe it inspires you to acknowledge people in your life that you're grateful for at an occasion that makes sense, where it's appropriate. Obviously, there are times where acknowledgements might be not appropriate or not in the best possible place for those types of acknowledgements, but they can be a way to honor people, to educate people, inform people, to share perspective, and to pass on something that then people could take with them and pass it on to others. So now I'm going to do acknowledgement. I got to make sure I get these papers right. So, are you ready for my acknowledgement? Okay. I acknowledge that the Teaching Support Staff Union deserves our support. They are workers who need wages, pensions for instructors, and full work years for ELCs. And I believe that I want to acknowledge that every worker deserves a union. That's my acknowledgement for tonight. I'm assuming that is not the acknowledgement you were expecting from me. So before I became an elected First Nations leader, I was actually a limited term lecturer at Simon Fraser University and taught just down the street at Harbour Centre, and worked as a limited term lecturer in First Nations languages for a number of years with SFU, and I would have been doing that for many more years had I not decided to run for elected office and get elected in 2017. But happy to say that the program that I helped founded in partnership with SFU is still continuing on, and a number of my students that I had taught during those years when I was teaching actually took over the program and continue to run and teach that program. And it was an adult immersion program for the Squamish language, and it's actually been expanded to a certificate. We started with a certificate, it now has a diploma program, and there's undergraduate and eventually master's programs also being offered through SFU for Indigenous languages, including the Squamish language. So as somebody who used to be a teacher at SFU, I really wanted to acknowledge the ongoing strike that is happening and the fight for dignified wages, for pensions, dignified pensions for workers, and the need for all of us to support. And so I call on everybody to support the TSSU and directly appeal to the SFU president on the serious perils and problems for precarious instructors. And I think these instructors deserve to get a pension plan so that they can eventually retire. And that's my opening acknowledgement for the night. So tonight's conversation, and I know there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers after, and I'll have a conversation with Am as well, because I really hope that this is something that shares the history or story of something, but also gives you practical examples. And there's actually going to be an interactive element to my lecture later on, where folks will be invited to participate in a very interesting way, fun way, where I will harness all of my grade 8 to 12 improv high school club skills as I ad-lib and improvise my answers with you, but we'll get to that in a little bit. The purpose of tonight is to really share some insights and understandings that have come about, I would say, or just been discovered over the last 6 years through my work that I've been fortunate to be a part of by using this document, this declaration, this tool that was created over many decades by many Indigenous thought leaders and community leaders and activists called the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, otherwise known as UNDRIP. And so my hope for tonight is to share my experiences in trying to utilize this document and also where it fits in within the broader conversations and work around Indigenous justice, the Indigenous rights, the advancement of Indigenous people, and then where that fits even in some of the conversations like reconciliation, which have become very dominant tools of discourse within institutions like universities or local governments, provincial governments, federal governments, even in industry. So the Indigenous Rights Declaration, from policy to practice. UNDRIP is considered a crucial framework for reconciliation, but it has been marred by sluggish progress that has bewildered many and impeded comprehensive understanding among policymakers. Although adopted by 143 UN member states a decade ago, and also adopted as a framework by the province of British Columbia in 2022, or 2021, and the Government of Canada in 2022, the realization of Indigenous rights has faced many formidable challenges. I feel that my role as an Indigenous political leader is to use power to achieve material change that addresses the needs and conditions of my constituents, or in other words, my people, or people like me. I was fortunate to be invited to be present at the BC Legislature for the adoption of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And I was also very fortunate to be one of the political leaders that spearheaded the development of the City of Vancouver's task force on the implementation of UNDRIP that I ended up co-chairing with Councillor Christine Boyle. And in response to the provincial adoption of their legislation, they created, it requires the creation of an action plan. And so when the province was developing their action plan, I also spearheaded the development of a Squamish Nation response to that action plan, which looked at a comprehensive response to all of the items that they had included and where we felt that they were either lacking or could be refined or improved relative to our own goals and understandings as a Squamish Nation. And so those conversations and that work over the last number of years have led me to I feel, gain an insight into UNDRIP, to Indigenous rights, and to taking a document like UNDRIP and actually translating it into something practical for people to use and to feel and to have it be meaningful in terms of impact. So although UNDRIP is a non-legally binding document, it represents a crucial step towards promoting and protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples worldwide. It provides a comprehensive framework for addressing issues such as self-determination, cultural integrity, land rights, and the right to participate in decision-making that affect our communities. Despite its non-binding nature, many countries have started to use UNDRIP as a basis for developing or amending their domestic legislation to protect Indigenous rights. The history of UNDRIP reflects a global effort to acknowledge Indigenous communities' historical injustices and promote our rights and well-being in the context of a rapidly changing world. While progress has been made, challenges persist. And so one of the interesting ways that I often try to remind people about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is when we look back at the conclusion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that looked into and studied the painful legacies of the Indian residential school system and came out of that collection of story and experiences from residential school survivors, it culminated in the TRC's calls to action. And if we look at call to action 43, it says, we call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the framework for reconciliation. So I often purposely use those words, framework for reconciliation. The reason being that reconciliation is a fraught term at times, largely because of its abstract nature, and this is the challenge that we have with a lot of political discourse, I would say especially more so on the progressive side of the political discourse, which is that we become attached to or have an affinity for using abstract conceptual terms to try and articulate our goals and objectives. But the problem with conceptual terms, whether it's reconciliation or many others, is that you can ascribe a lot of meaning to those words relative to your own sort of morals or your own values. And then the word can end up meaning very different things to different groups of people. So as an example, you have oil and gas companies using reconciliation as a tool for advancing a conversation the same way that local activists, land defender groups, or policymakers within a government might be using them. And so you have a different sense of what that could be depending on your own vantage point. But that also means that we have the ability to define it through the conversations and through the repetition and through the practices that we have. But what I love about this call to action is that it actually takes a concept like reconciliation and then ascribes a framework to it that is actually very specific and very tangible. So what I often have to remind people, I think, when they are using terms like reconciliation in a way that is almost meaningless or very watered down, is that if you actually look at the TRC's calls to action, which came out with a number of calls to action around reconciliation, they literally define reconciliation as using and implementing UNDRIP as the framework for reconciliation. So if you want to know what reconciliation means, or if anybody ever asks, you can point them to this concept that the framework for reconciliation is UNDRIP. But of course, UNDRIP uses a lot of abstract concepts and terms that also, I think, bear an examination. As an example, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a declaration of rights. So what do rights mean in this context? In Canada and in many countries and nation states, legal rights are enforceable by a legal system. But the declaration as a non-binding sort of declaration was always intended or written to be a tool to be able to use for interpretive purposes and to be used in conjunction with understanding other human rights declarations and documents like the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And when UNDRIP was created by leadership at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples starting in 1982 up until when it was adopted in 2007, it was always understood and articulated as being an additional component, an additional human rights document to existing international human rights document. That it was understood and written, intended to be a human rights declaration that was specifically written in the context of Indigenous peoples who needed something additional to other human rights tools, that there are unique circumstances and experiences and contexts that Indigenous people around the world are operating in that needed something in addition to other types of documents when it came to our human rights protections. So taking that concept down into legal rights, where we're at today is the rights as they're described there are very aspirational. They're principles or values that we are trying to find a way to implement, but they are not yet legally enforceable rights within Canadian law, whether at a provincial or federal level. But we'll talk a little bit more about what Canada at the provincial and federal level and municipal level have tried to do to take that document and actually translate it into something tangible. So a good example of this is Romeo Saganash, who is the NDP MP, who put forward one of the first bills around implementing UNDRIP at the federal level. That bill went through a number of readings and it never got fully adopted, and it wasn't until more recently when the federal Liberal Party, working with the NDP, then passed a legislation for the implementation of UNDRIP, which is now the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, the federal legislation. However, what was interesting is the legislation that Romeo Saganash had proposed ended up becoming, even though it hadn't been passed yet at the federal level, became a bit of the template that was then used and adopted by the provincial government, and in terms of the negotiations that were done between the First Nations Leadership Council and the province around implementing some sort of UNDRIP-based legislation. So they used the federal legislation, or the draft federal bill, as a basis for the provincial bill, but they also added things to it that weren't in the original federal bill and never actually even shown up in the federal legislation once it was passed. So I want to focus on what DRIPA in the BC context really means and what it looks like. So DRIPA has like 4 components that I think are really important to highlight. So one of the main components, and this isn't verbatim language, I've sort of summarized it or tried to put it in plain language. So one of the main components is that in consultation and cooperation with the Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, the government must take all measures necessary to ensure the laws of British Columbia are consistent with the Declaration. So it takes both a forward-looking view and a backwards-looking view to say that all laws in BC must be consistent with the principles of the Declaration. So that really sets out that as laws are created or amended, or if laws need to be amended, it has to kind of go through this process of like a lens applied to it and look at it and say, does this actually connect with the principles of UNDRIP? Another key component of the provincial legislation is that the government must prepare and implement an action plan to achieve the objectives. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Must prepare a report every year to report on progress. And then here's an interesting one. This is one of the points I wanted to make, is that this is a section of the provincial legislation that did not show up in the original NDP bill at the federal level, nor did it ever show up in the final legislation that was then adopted by the federal government. So the other key component of the provincial legislation is it authorizes the province to negotiate and enter into an agreement with an Indigenous governing body for the exercise of statutory power of decision jointly by the Indigenous governing body, the province, or another decision maker for the consent of the Indigenous governing body before the exercise of a statutory power of decision. So the actual section in the legislation is a bit more convoluted than that, and this is my attempt to try and summarize it. I'm going to explain it briefly for those that might not have a legal background, including myself, and it took a long time for me to understand this. So the province has their structure of how they create laws, like many provinces, including Canada, and one of the things that they do is they create what is referred to as a statutory power, which is that they are able to delegate certain decision-making to a delegated either person or body. So for example, a legislation on a particular topic might give a minister authority to give final sign-off on certain things, as opposed to that decision having to go to cabinet all the time. Or it might give an executive director within one of the ministries the ability to sign off on certain things. So when you think about an example like permits in the provincial system, oil and gas permits, environmental certificates for small projects, there's all kinds of permits that are required in order for a project to proceed. Those are all statutory powers. So what this section was really getting at, and it's kind of, I find it to be the most interesting section, is it says that before the province can exercise a statutory power, they can enter into agreements with Indigenous governing bodies to get Indigenous consent before that statutory power is actually made. So this was a tool that was intended to be able to create a kind of a doorway for the province to actually start sharing in decision-making over their statutory powers before they make them. Now, again, this is an example of language that is coming out of UNDRIP and then showing up in provincial legislation. And the key word here that is often quoted from UNDRIP is consent. Because one of the main principles that shows up through UNDRIP is free, prior, and informed consent. So this was an interesting and novel idea that was included within the DRIPA legislation. Now, what was interesting about the timeline on this is that when this was written, there was a hope and an understanding that this particular part of the legislation would then allow for the province and for Indigenous governing bodies to start sharing statutory decision-making on all laws as they've been established within BC. So anytime the government is making a decision, First Nations could enter into agreement with the province to be able to share in that decision-making and to be able to create a process where the nations would give their consent on that decision-making. Ironically, and sadly, there was a Supreme Court decision with another province not too long after this law was passed, and it was determined that in terms of the interpretive parts of the legislation, that it couldn't apply to all statutory powers as they're already established. It could only apply to new legislation that explicitly gives and creates a shared statutory decision-making authority within that legislation. So when this was first created, the hope was that all statutory decision-making could now be shared with Indigenous peoples in BC, but after a Supreme Court decision with another province, it actually got watered down to, no, actually it's only limited to legislation that explicitly includes references to powers to create shared decision-making. It doesn't apply to every legislation, so you have to go through every legislation and amend it to then create that power. However, since DRIPA was passed in BC, there have actually been a number of number of bills put forward and passed that do give the province the ability to share in decision-making with Indigenous governing bodies. And a good example of that is the Environmental Assessment Act, which was reviewed and amended, and explicitly includes a section in there about obtaining Indigenous consent when granting an environmental certificate for projects going forward. That didn't exist 10 years ago or even I think 5 years ago. So there's a number of projects in BC that have started to move in that direction but had to use contract law to have the same effect. We're now seeing legislation actually amended to reflect those principles within UNDRIP, again, following the spirit and intent of the DRIPA legislation. But and so this is a section that did not show up in the federal legislation at all. There is no concept in the federal legislation around sharing decision-making. The federal legislation only speaks to amending laws and action plan and accountability report, basically. But when we looked at the topic of how do you implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples within a municipal context, and in particular within an urban center like Vancouver, we had to face that problem in a different way. So in the city of Vancouver, instead of being able to pass legislation, because the city of Vancouver does not have lawmaking authority, they have bylaw making authority, but bylaws are for authorities or jurisdiction that the province has granted to the municipality. We had to operate within sort of the frameworks that the city of Vancouver has established, which is either bylaws and policy. And then one of the ways that you create policy change is you develop a strategy, and the city of Vancouver has a number of strategies on all kinds of topics, whether it's climate, whether it's waste, whether it's affordable housing. There's all kinds of strategies that they've developed, and then it is a guiding document for the departments to then implement all of the deliverables that are expected in that strategy. So we chose to adopt this model of using a UNDRIP strategy with the intention that the UNDRIP strategy would then create an action plan, which is underway right now, and I'll speak to in a little bit. But the other thing that we intentionally did was in our UNDRIP strategy with the City of Vancouver, we adopted these 4 themes and came up with 79 calls to action, actions that the 3 nations, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, felt would meaningfully implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And the themes are social, cultural, and economic well-being, ending Indigenous-specific racism and discrimination, self-determination, inherent rights of self-government, and rights and title of Indigenous peoples. The actual strategy that was developed through an intergovernmental task force with representatives from the three nations and the City of Vancouver Council came about over a year-long conversations where we were having half-day meetings every 3 weeks for about 11 months, working with a team of very wonderful staff from the City of Vancouver who I learned so much from, especially around how to take a project like this and actually make it manageable. And that led to us developing the UNDRIP strategy, which outlines, as I said, 79 different actions that the City of Vancouver can take to implement Indigenous rights from the perspective of the three local First Nations who are the title and rights holders here in Vancouver. And we concluded that work with a ceremony at Sanok at the Vancouver Museum, and had the nations actually gift the strategy to the City of Vancouver in a ceremony, and had the city officials participate in the ceremony following Coast Salish tradition. The UNDRIP task force was also a very insightful experience for a number of us, because we were dealing with topics that have never really been broached within the concept of UNDRIP. And we even had Indigenous leaders who had participated in the negotiations at the UN in New York and in Geneva through the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples that were actually part of the negotiations, tell us that when they were writing UNDRIP, they had never thought at that time about what it would mean to take something like the UN Declaration and actually ask municipalities to implement it. That wasn't on the concept at the time. They were really focused on thinking about the nation states and really the national governments, maybe the sub-regional governments like provinces, but not at the level of a local government. But of course, local governments are a pivotal part of our democratic system here in Canada and many other places, because of the way that they're able to, I would say, try out new things and to experiment and to innovate and to be able to do things that are later adopted by provincial and federal governments. And so when we were working through many of the difficult conversations at the city level, we had to grapple with things like, what does implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People mean with regard to the title and rights holders? And the UN Declaration outlines very specific rights as it relates to the landowners and the people who own the territory, as opposed to Indigenous people who now call Vancouver home, but are not ancestrally tied or connected to the three local nations who have been here for thousands of years and hold territorial rights to this area. Those are two concepts that had never really been broached within this concept of implementing Indigenous rights. And so it was a very difficult concept for us to wrap our heads around about what does that look like or what does that mean. And I would say that one of the really interesting parts of that conversation is that it came about organically over many of our meetings, and really trying to understand, what does this mean, and what do our teachings say about this? And there was, beautiful stories about some of our elders who no longer with us, and times when they would come into a room or they would participate, in conversations in support of urban Indigenous communities, and speak about how, as the nations from this territory, we have obligations to host people within our territory, and that in order to be good hosts, we want to make sure that we are there to support them as our guests or our relatives who are visiting our territory. And at the same time, there was a talk around elders who had shared teachings around that also creates a reciprocal relationship of whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous to these lands, that being a guest in this territory to other nations' territories also comes with its own obligations and responsibilities, and that there is a relationship that is formed through that. But as it relates to a document like UNDRIP and what it means for a local government to try and grapple with these questions, I would say that where we landed was not that we have the full answer on this question, but that we have a better understanding of at least where we fit in as the three nations in the territory here, and how we can better give guidance to the City of Vancouver in its relationship with urban Indigenous communities who the City of Vancouver also owes responsibilities and relationship with, but that there is a distinct difference between first starting from the place of title, meaning Aboriginal title, Indigenous title to the land means territorial rights to the land and what that means, then flowing from there into our rights as Indigenous people, whether Aboriginal rights or Indigenous rights, which are articulated in different ways. Because as I'm reminded by Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, the president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, our rights as Indigenous peoples come from our land. It starts with the title and our ownership of our land, and then our rights stem from that, whether it's our rights to food, whether it's rights to our culture, our economic well-being, our housing, our education, our language. All of that stems from our place, because we are, as we describe ourselves, indigenous to a place. And so from that conversation came this insight of, as the Indigenous governing body on behalf of the Indigenous peoples from this land, there is a unique government-to-government relationship that is needed between the three nations and the City of Vancouver. That within that relationship, there are particular actions and steps that the City of Vancouver can take to meaningfully implement Indigenous rights as it relates to our nations, and that we are only capable of articulating what that means for us in our context, that we are not the best people or the right people to be able to articulate what does Indigenous rights implementation mean for all the other Indigenous people who now call Vancouver home, that the city also owes a responsibility to. But that is also a place for other types of Indigenous governing bodies, and there are numerous, that operate within Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory to provide service and programs to their own citizens. As an example, a Council of the Haida Nation has a unique governing structure where they give a dedicated seat within their elected council to Haida residents that live in Vancouver. The Nisga'a Lism's government has a dedicated service provision within Vancouver for Nisga'a people living here. There's a number of other examples where other First Nations who are not Indigenous to the territory come here and provide service to their people, just like our nations provide service to our people no matter where they live as well. So that was a understanding. There was an understanding that came about from very organic, very meaningful conversations where we were just in a room together as leaders. And the thing that I found most fascinating about working through with the City of Vancouver versus, say, the provincial or federal governments, and maybe it's because of scale or because of bureaucracy or for some other reason, is that the work to develop the UNDRIP strategy in the City of Vancouver was never a negotiation. We never described it as a negotiation. It was a conversation and a project that we were working on together, that everybody was making their best efforts to achieve the goal of coming up with a strategy, and that there was good faith attempts by everybody around the table to both understand each other and support things. And so when you actually look at the strategy as it's developed, and I would encourage everybody to read the strategy, including all the specific actions, because they are so unique to what a city can do, is it covers everything you could imagine, from giving access to Musqueam and Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh people to ceremonial and cultural sites. It includes economic opportunities for member-owned businesses or businesses owned by Musqueam, Squamish, or Tsleil-Waututh people, to the procurement opportunities within the City of Vancouver. It includes employment and training for our people to be able to access to careers and jobs within the City of Vancouver. But it also includes other topics that were not reported on widely in the media when this work came forward, but it includes topics like revenue sharing on property taxes and development charges. It includes the transfer of municipal-owned land back to the nations. It includes other types of arrangements to support Indigenous or MST decision-making, co-decision-making with the City of Vancouver. It also includes representation on governing bodies such as Metro Vancouver Board, the Mayor's Council, Park Board, School Board, and perhaps even the Vancouver City Council, to explore those things. And there's models of that already happening elsewhere. As an example, the Tsawwassen First Nations, through their final agreement, included representation on both Metro Vancouver Board and on the Mayor's Council. And so now the work that's happening, that's literally underway as we speak, is taking the 79 calls to action within the UNDRIP strategy and actually turning it into a tangible action plan. And by action plan, I mean who's responsible for implementing which call to action, what's the timeline for implementing all of these things, what is the budgetary requirements to implement each of these, and also what is the order of preference or prioritization from the nation's perspective of let's accomplish these things first, and then these things second, and these things third. Because as Former chief for the Kwikwet-Sutino-Khohwatmis, Bob Chamberlain, once said to me in a meeting with a bunch of chiefs was, if we have 79 priorities, then we really have no priorities. And so the work that we've been doing as a nations, and we'll be coming back to the public in the new year, is a fully fleshed out action plan that actually has timelines, resources, prioritization, and a much more descriptive vision for each of the actions, because right now the actions are very aspirational goals and objectives. They're actually that get more specific into implementing a number of them. That document, the strategy, is actually much more substantive and is much more meaningful, has much more detail than anything you would see in both the provincial action plan or in the federal action plan. There's a lot of good stuff in those action plans, but they're all very general and they're very broad. And as an example of that, when the province released their action plan, one of the big sticking points that Squamish Nation had with it is that at various times it would include actions like co-develop legislation with Indigenous governing bodies towards something, and it would explicitly say co-develop legislation, and then 4 bullets later it would say launch a consultative process on the question of co-developing legislation on X, Y, or Z. And we were saying, why is there a discrepancy between these, and why would you commit to launching a consultative process? You're already required to amend legislation to make it compliant with UNDRIP. So there was these ways where, from a policy language, we were taking issue with. But within the UNDRIP strategy, because we were operating at, I think, a much more local level and a much more down-to-earth level, we were able to actually push the needle much further and the envelope much further. And what I think is exciting about that too, one of the pieces that I think makes it important, and why Vancouver was able to do this, is that over successive of now 3 separate governments in City Hall in Vancouver. If I think about the current one, the previous one, and the one before that, we've had, I don't want to call it nonpartisan support, because I don't think that's the right word. I almost like to jokingly call it multi-partisan support, because we've had political parties on all sides of the political spectrum within City Hall support things like the implementation of UNDRIP and reconciliation, and have not politicized issues of Indigenous rights and Indigenous well-being the way that we would see it done elsewhere or with other parties or other levels of government. And that, I think, has allowed for that type of relationship to be built between the nations and within the city of Vancouver, and why even across the political spectrum we're seeing a support for the work that we're doing. But I also think it goes a little bit more deep than that, because I think that would be a surface level sort of explanation of it. Because I think it's easy for lots of politicians or political forces to make promises and make commitments, and many times, sometimes they don't implement them. Sometimes they do. But I think what's actually the underlying aspect of it is that the First Nations, whether it's our First Nations here in Vancouver or elsewhere, are increasingly becoming more and more powerful. And with that power becomes the ability for governments or industry or institutions in general to be able to accomplish things that they otherwise couldn't without the support or without the inclusion of First Nations. And so as an example of that, we're seeing governments at all levels and across multiple parties want to support First Nations leading in the development of both market and non-market housing within highly expensive markets like Vancouver. And there are more and more First Nations like MST that are seeing land return back to their communities, and they're going to use it for the purposes of developing housing to generate wealth for their communities, as well as affordable housing for their own community. There's a number of First Nations across the country that are starting to do that now. And you'll see more and more of these projects get announced as they become public. But you're also seeing governments at the provincial and federal and municipal level want to partner with First Nations because, as we've demonstrated with projects like Sanok, we can do it faster, we can do more of it. We incorporate our values in a way that I think is meaningful, whether it's on climate or whether it's on affordability. And we're also in it for the long haul. And we want to be able to generate long-term revenue to support our communities in terms of programs and services for our community, but we also want to be able to create something that has a strong legacy and sustainability for a long time. So that's some of the experience that we've had in trying to wrestle with these 48 articles of UNDRIP. And one of the really powerful aspects that I think comes to mind when I think about UNDRIP, and this is one of the things that I would leave I want to share with everybody tonight is when we look at the language that we use around the UN Declaration, so often the language is around implement. The TRC calls to action said implement UNDRIP, affirm and implement, or endorse and implement. But I often find that that language doesn't necessarily, it's not evocative enough, it's not inspirational enough to really get to what is it that we're trying to accomplish, because what does implement mean? What I kind of stumbled upon when I was really reflecting on UNDRIP and as we were doing the work was actually, I found the inspiration I was looking for in the very first article, which says Indigenous peoples have the right to the full enjoyment as a collective or as individuals of all human rights and fundamental freedoms as recognized in the Charter of the United Nations, Charter of the United, sorry, there's a typo here, my fault. Charter of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and International Human Rights Law. So I think about this concept of enjoyment as opposed to implement. What would it look like for Indigenous people to fully enjoy all of the rights as they're described within the UN Declaration? And the concept of joy is also something that I think is very human, and it's something that many people can relate to. So whether we take examples or concepts like, the joy you feel from seeing a friend that you haven't seen in a long time, or the joy you feel in getting, in applying for, say, affordable housing at a nonprofit and getting accepted because you won't have to pay exorbitant rents anymore, or the joy you might feel from successfully fighting for fair wages and a pension from your employer and winning at that. There's lots of things that I think bring joy, and we know what that means to feel joy and to bring joy to somebody or to receive joy. So then we think about Indigenous rights. What does it mean to have Indigenous people, both as collectives and as individuals, experience the full enjoyment of Indigenous rights? And so this is part where I start to look at the articles of UNDRIP and start going through them and thinking about, okay, this is actually a way easier way for me to conceptually think about these rights and what they describe. And one of the interesting things about the UN Declaration is that when you read it, it was also written as a document that was specific, as I mentioned earlier, specifically targeted towards nation states and nation state governments. And it's written as a shield to try and protect Indigenous people from the types of practices that we have seen both historically and currently by nation states towards Indigenous people, and really intended to be a protection of the collective and individual rights that we have as Indigenous people. It's not written as necessarily a true expression of Indigenous existence and identity necessarily, but it is a set of articles or principles intended to protect Indigenous people within that context. So it's one of many tools to be used when we think about Indigenous people and an advancement of Indigenous people. So, but I like this idea of enjoyment, the full enjoyment of Indigenous rights. So this is the part where I gave you the heads up that we're going to have some interactive moments now. This is why I have two laptops, and hopefully my battery didn't die. So what I want to do is I'm going to show you an example of this. If I can pull it up. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to ask people, and you can put your hand up, and then you will shout out a number. But I want people to give me a number between 1 and 43, and I'm going to look up the article, and I'm going to read it out, and I'll give you an example of what I think joy looks like within that context. So put your hand up first. Okay, over here. 27. Let's start with 27. Lucky 27, right? So Article 27, states shall establish and implement, in conjunction with Indigenous peoples concerned, a fair, independent, impartial, open, and transparent process, giving due recognition to Indigenous peoples' laws, traditions, customs, and land tenure systems, to recognize and adjudicate the rights of Indigenous peoples pertaining to their land, territories, and resources, including those which were traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used. Indigenous peoples shall have the right to participate in this process. So, lengthy paragraph, but essentially speaking about land management, land control, territorial rights. So, this is a good example. There are a number of various projects that have been proposed or implemented in Canada over the last 150 years that did not include, the participation of Indigenous peoples in deciding those projects of whether they would happen at all or whether how they would be designed in general. And so when I think about this and I think about the full enjoyment, this is the ability for Indigenous people to actually participate and shape the outcome of things happening within their territories. So a historical example where this wasn't followed was when the North Shore wastewater treatment facility was built just at the foot of the north side of Lionsgate Bridge, right next to the Squamish Nation Reserve. So the provincial government expropriated a chunk of land from my nation's reserve, then built the wastewater treatment plant that provided all the waste treatment for the North Shore and Vancouver. And took the lands away, and then we've had to deal with the consequences of that ever since. Now, there is a new wastewater treatment plant being built, well, eventually, hopefully, but the old one will be decommissioned, and the land's actually going to be returned to the Squamish Nation and then added back into our reserve. So that's a historical, I would say, injustice where our Indigenous rights weren't fully enjoyed. But what we're seeing now is projects where Indigenous peoples are actually playing a decision-making role to be able to apply conditions to a project, to be able to shape the outcome of the project, and actually influence projects so that they benefit the nations. A good example of that is Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh worked successfully with the City of Vancouver and the University of British Columbia to lobby both TransLink, the Mayor's Council, and the federal government, provincial government to include a SkyTrain station at our Jericho Lands development in Point Grey. Originally, there wasn't a plan for a stop there, but we successfully advocated for one, and now one will be built there, significantly allowing us to increase both the density of the development, but also, as a result, increase the number of affordable homes we'll be able to build in that development as well. So let's do another one. 7. Can anybody read? Does anybody know the 7th article offhand? No, I'm just kidding. So Article 7, Indigenous individuals have the rights to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty, and security of person. 2, Indigenous peoples have the collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as distinct peoples and should not be subjugated to any act of genocide or any other act of violence, including forcibly removing children of the group to another group. Makes sense, right? So here's a good example of something that's happening right now. There is 8 First Nations within BC that are currently developing their own education laws, and Squamish is one of them. So there was legislation passed at the federal and provincial level that affirmed First Nations and Indigenous peoples have the right to education and the right to control our own education systems. So it's enabling legislation, and we're now in the process of developing our own law that would define our own education institutions and structures. It gives us the authority to create governance around our own school system. So if we wanted to create a school board, we could, and some First Nations have done that. But it also gives us the ability to create our own curriculum and our own teacher certification within that system. And then it could be recognized by the provincial system, but we would have our system, and then they're recognizing our system, not us trying to just recognize theirs. And so there's examples of where First Nations are leading to create, I think, the full enjoyment of this right, which is that we can actually educate our children in our own systems of our own design based off our own values. I will maybe do one more. Okay, over here. 39. I'm really sad nobody picked 42, because that's the best number. Thank you. We'll come back to that one. You said 39, right? Yeah. Okay. Indigenous peoples have the right to have access to financial and technical assistance from states and through international cooperation for the enjoyment of the rights contained in this declaration. That's an interesting one. So Indigenous peoples have the right to have access to financial and technical assistance. I like this one. This is actually one of my favorite ones because it's all-encompassing, and it's my favorite one to remind provincial and federal ministers when they are not providing enough financial capacity for us to participate in a process. So one of the ways that this has translated into like real tangible kind of results is a number of First Nations are now being actively consulted with and collaborated with on various projects that might impact their rights. So anything from a water main getting fixed to a major development near a potential archaeological site to power lines that are having to be installed, or a provincial park that's being amended to allow for something to happen. So there's lots of different kind of, we call them referrals. It's where a company or a third party, could be a government agency, a crown agency, or a company is seeking to do something, and they have to consult and collaborate with the title and rights holders. And this actually touches on another concept that I haven't gotten to yet, but is around free, prior, and informed consent, which it's related to. So when a company wants to, or a third party wants to engage in that type of referral, we have a process where we do an intake. They are asked to fill out a base level of information about their project and what it would be and what type of impacts it might be. And then our department within our government then provides an analysis back to them and says, based off the information that you submitted, here's additional information that we think would be needed for us to be able to assess this proposal, as well as here is an estimated cost in terms of capacity funding that you have to provide to us in order for us to actually even review your proposal. So it might start out with a $35,000 capacity funding that has to be received up front. And then after that initial assessment, they might come back and say, okay, we've done an initial assessment. We actually now need $200,000 to complete a number of environmental studies or habitat studies, cultural studies, engineering studies to look at alternatives to, something they might be proposing. And that concept is actually really important because it ties to the concept of free, prior, and informed consent. And what I've often reminded policymakers and political leaders is that if the nations if Indigenous people are having to participate in your process, but we are not being compensated for our participation in that process, then it's actually technically not free, because we're having to spend our own money to participate in your process. So we're paying to participate in your process. That is not the definition of free. And so free means that we are able to be financially supported to be able to get to consent. And then you got free, and then prior. Prior means that there is a pre-established process, that it happens before the project even happens, or is before a decision is made by a nation state. So there's a prior involvement of the nations. Informed means that we have access to all the information and all of the data, knowledge, analysis in order to be able to make the decision. And then the consent is the last piece, where we're able to actually apply either a set of conditions to a project, changes that are required to a project, or potentially even saying no to a project because of the level of impact that it might have to our communities and our people in our territory. So this is it's actually one of my favorite articles within UNDRIP. And then I'll quickly do 42, because people know about 42, right? Yes? Good. For those that don't know, come talk to me later, and I'll tell you. There's a great book I can recommend to you about it. The United Nations, its bodies, including the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples and specialized agencies, including at the country level and states, shall promote respect for and full application of the provisions of this declaration and follow up the effectiveness of this declaration. So, this is an interesting one because it's really focused on both the UN and nation states. Is that there is a positive obligation on nation states to the words are promote respect for and full application of the provisions of the declaration. So, full enjoyment means that we are seeing nation states actually follow through on the commitment to implement this. So those are examples of, when I think about full enjoyment of the articles here, and I think about the role that broader Canadian society plays around supporting Indigenous rights, it's a question of how much are we advocating, pressuring, holding political parties and governments and leaders, policymakers accountable for this, ensuring that there is measurable outcomes and deliverables, and that Indigenous peoples are experiencing the full enjoyment of these rights. And I think it goes to as well, these ideas around, for example, national interest, which often come up once in a while within, political discourse around national interest. For a while it was around pipelines. Pipelines are in the national interest of the country. Of course, national interest is this concept that is largely influenced by the powerful within our country, whether it's in media or industry, or those with capital and political leaders. It's not, national interest is not often shaped by ordinary working class people in this country. It's often shaped by the powerful. But at the same time, there is the ability for those of us who are not the powerful or as powerful as I would say the truly powerful, both in Canada and abroad, is our ability to then shape the national interests through the tools and systems and processes that we have to be able to shape them. And we've seen that happen over the last 10 years, where conversations like around Indigenous rights, around reconciliation, have evolved and advanced in ways that were probably unfathomable to Indigenous leaders, 20, 30, or 40 years ago. And so, and I've experienced that. I've experienced elders in my community say that, when they were a young man or a young woman in our community, and they worked alongside some of our great leaders who are our esteemed leaders in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, that the relationship between First Nations and Canada was so fraught that the ideas and the actions that are being taken today were not even conceivable at the time. And yet we're here now. And now the question begs, what is the next step and where are we going from here? And what's the next level of transformation to be accomplished? What are the things that we today would say, oh, that's totally unfathomable and can never happen in Canada? But in 50 years, people will look back and talk about how, yeah, there was a time when people didn't think this was possible, but now we're here. And I think that's the work of UNDRIP and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and generally the movement to fight for Indigenous rights within Canada and abroad. And so I'll leave you with that note and just also mention that if you want to learn more, I mentioned a few of the documents, our strategic plan for the Squamish Nation, which is available online. We have an annual report of the Squamish Nation that describes a lot of this work that's happening. We're also, just putting out a little plug, we're also going to be coming out with a book launch in the new year where we are going to be publishing our very first history book of the Squamish Nation that describes, it's an introduction to Squamish history, and it's written from the perspective of one of our people who is actually a journalist, Stephanie Wood, who writes for the Narwhal, is also a Squamish Nation member, went to the University of British Columbia, worked with a team of researchers from our community and our staff and our elders and put together this really beautiful book that gives a high-level sort of overview and summary of our history, but is a great way to get introduced to Squamish history. And so, stay tuned for that. It's called Tinatchit Titameo, We Come From This Land, and that'll be released in January with some book launches happening in the fall as well. So, thank you.
So thank you so much for that wonderful talk. There was a lot in there. I'll just start with a couple of questions to get started, and then we'll go out to the audience for questions. There's been so many incredible leaders from here that have worked globally and internationally. I think people like George Manuel and Art Manuel who worked pushing for human rights at the UN level. I'm wondering, as you talked about the implementation of UNDRIP and the local levels, as you've been discussing with the city, the province, the federal government, what are some areas that are actually quite actionable quickly, and what are some things that will require a little bit more work, at least at the planning level, in terms of the issues you've been taking forward?
That is a good question. So the stuff that I think is actually really real and is happening, I think some of the things, they'll be like kind of slow announcements. It's not going to be one big announcement because it's so targeted to each of the different First Nations that are around the country. But there are a lot of very live, very active negotiations, conversations around returning land to Indigenous communities. And it's already happening and has happened over the last decade by all levels of government. I think it's actually going to increase, and we'll see more of that. So I think it's actually a really tangible thing. Like the idea of land back, which to some people might have seemed radical 10 years ago, is actually happening now. So I think that continued push for land to be repatriated, and it's one of the articles that land should either be repatriated or compensated for Indigenous people is an article of UNDRIP, and I think that's really happening. Where I think that there are impediments to the full enjoyment of Indigenous rights and the full regime change or systems change that's required for that is actually the problem with treasury boards. So the provincial and federal treasury board, I heard this quote at one point that from another Indigenous leader that they were told that the treasury board for the province and the feds is probably the biggest impediment to Indigenous rights in our country and has been the biggest impediment to Indigenous rights and has actually been largely responsible for most of the harm caused, because if you think about anything that has happened on the not positive or negative side, it has to go through treasury board. And the politics of what gets through there and how and why is often, I think, a mystery, but it again goes to that. What are the politicians, what are the political leaders, what are the civil servants being told or experiencing in the public, where there is support for the type of funding and capacity that is needed to create that systems change. And I think that's where we run into all the roadblocks, is for a lot of First Nations, it's not being able to see the fiscal arrangement change.
I guess one other question just around, there's a whole bureaucratic class, a political class of leadership that have gone through universities of a particular time, that they're still in a way learning how to do this, and so there's an underdevelopment on that side. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to what you see as critiques of how bureaucracies are moving, how they're analyzing policy as it relates to the Declaration on Indigenous Rights.
Yeah, I like that question too. So I would say that one of the paradigm shifts that are happening right now, especially within Canadian bureaucracies, is the way that civil services and bureaucracies and bureaucrats view, let's call it First Nations interests or Indigenous interests within the broader framework around public interest. And from my own experience, and I think for the experience of many Indigenous leaders, there was a long time where many, I would say, senior bureaucrats, whether at a provincial, federal level, even to a certain extent at a local level, would view this sort of equation as there's the public interest and there's First Nations interests over here. And their role as bureaucrats is to help manage the public interest, and they're there to serve the public interest in a nonpartisan way. And it's really about this sort of negotiation between this First Nations interest and whatever the public interest is willing to bear. But what I think has actually shifted, and I'm seeing it more with sort of the next generation of civil servants that are moving through the ranks as people retire and mindsets are changed, is that this concept of public interest being over here and First Nations interest being over here is actually being replaced with a new one, which is public interest is actually a larger circle and First Nations interests are actually within it. And that if you actually view the success of First Nations interests as a way to actually benefit the larger public interest, then you can actually line those things up, that they're not sort of opposed to each other. And so as an example of that, I often talk about that, whether it's in rural communities or even urban communities, First Nations controlling and owning the resources of our communities is going to have a much more net positive impact on our neighbors in our communities than, for example, if some investment firm in New York City owns the mountain or owns the water or owns the electricity, things like that. That Indigenous control means that it's actually your neighbors that are controlling it. And of course, the benefits of that is it's going to be shared locally, it's going to be owned locally, it'll be sustained locally, it'll be held in the long term. And so I think that's where, like one example of where I think those things can align.
In terms of the context of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, in terms of what are some recommendations related to universities or the education system or supporting Indigenous nations to have the types of training and education that's necessary for the kinds of things that nations need to be able to assert those rights? Yeah.
I feel like that's another talk. No, I'm just kidding. So the challenge that I think at the university level or the post-secondary level is that things, people laugh if you agree, are painfully slow.
Like
yeah. Like honestly, even slower than I think governments are on these things. And so being able to get to meaningful outcomes is a very slow game. I would say the other, like I said, there's a lot that I could say about this one, but I guess the other little concept I can leave people with is I have noticed, or I feel like I'm aware, or my critique generally is that a lot of post-secondary institutions have become very obsessed with abstract concepts and have become obsessed with almost morally essentialist positions as opposed to policy and program that materially benefits or materially changes conditions for people. There's a lot of sort of symbolic focus. There's a lot of, or at least only focusing on the symbolic as the early wins, that the real tangible stuff that really gets to the material impacts and the material benefits, material change, don't seem to show up as much, or it's not a focus within post-secondary institutions. And so, as an example, you get a lot of these things around, decolonizing curriculum or indigenizing a curriculum. And that's not to say that those things aren't necessarily going to be important or useful. It's just that there's such abstract concepts that when it really comes down to it, it's like, where are we addressing material needs and conditions of Indigenous people and improving the quality of life for Indigenous people? And as those concepts how are they tied together? I don't know. So there's things like that where I think that we could do a lot more in shifting our focus towards a material concept of our work.
I think we'll open it up to questions, and if you could sort of take about a minute to ask your question, and we'll take 3 in a row so we get to as many as possible. There's a couple of mics that are going to be going around.
And I'll ask for something from those that want to ask a question. The thing about panels is sometimes people don't want to ask questions. They want to also share their thoughts for 5 minutes. So I think we'll be pretty stiff on wanting to hear questions from people. And I'll challenge you, if you don't get to a question within a minute, I'll be asking you to make a $20 donation to an Indigenous organization of my choosing. So.
E Tananad. I'm the Indigenous Arts and Culture Planner for the City of Vancouver and one of the co-leads on the Historical Atlas. And I'm here with my team. And I'd love to hear more about the dream, the vision, what inspired the Historical Atlas in the 79 calls.
Thank you. We're doing 2 more. Then I'll answer all 3 together.
Yeah, hi, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much. And you already mentioned this a bit, but I'm a PhD student at SFU, and when I first came here, I was really surprised and really appreciate land acknowledgement in the university. But after a while, it's like, is there anything positive happening after acknowledgement? And yeah, I'm really curious if SFU is doing anything, or as a member of the university, like what can I do to make a positive change? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge. My question is, I'm quite interested in the elderly. Are there any provision in this Declaration of Indigenous Rights for, or gives any rights to the elderly? And how does this declaration relates to other declarations of United Nations like women's rights? And okay, that's my question.
I'll go backwards and then I'll work. Thank you. I did not take my ADHD medication today, so some memory issues. Atlas, yes. So one of the things that really happened in the conversations with the 3 nations is just really how much there's still more work to do to educate the public around the history of the three nations and our existence and our history, our identity, who we are, both as distinct communities and as also, I think, shared history and connection. And so there were a few examples. That the Stalo Historical Atlas has been around for a number of years as an example, a quite famous example. I think a lot of people have become familiar with. And so it was kind of referenced as like, they did the project like that. It would be great if we had something like that for the three nations, just so that we can really share, again, the introductory kind of concepts, and celebrate things and do it in a way that is accessible for people. So maybe instead of doing a very text-heavy book, it's more images and figures and illustrations, but also something that can be used in the schools, used with employees at, say, the City of Vancouver or other institutions, and becomes something like that. And it was also identified as an early action for that reason, as it's sort of like a low-hanging fruit, quick win kind of project where it could have a lot of benefit really quickly. So, yeah. And then on land acknowledgements, yeah. So I have a very complicated relationship with land acknowledgements in the sense that I think they're going through this sort of there's a pendulum, right? Like a lot of things in politics are a pendulum, or maybe it's a circle, and the pendulum is just going around like this. But there's this sort of oscillation where land acknowledgements are, I think rightly so, being criticized as either hollow or perfunctory or kind of meaningless potentially. And there's a lot of criticism or critique of land acknowledgements and whether they're useful or practical or whatever. The challenge is that I think that there's also just a historical understanding of land acknowledgements and where they come from and why we are now at a place where, yeah, they might actually feel not that meaningful. I remember being quite young and going to events with my late grandmother where she was asked as an elder of the community to come and give a territorial welcoming, which was kind of the precursor to land acknowledgements in the reverse, right? So, like I don't do it a land acknowledgement. I will welcome you to the territory, but I don't do a land acknowledgement. But she would acknowledge the territories and do those types of things like how she was taught. But she was often doing them in places where there would be comments afterwards, in response that I think were quite prejudicial, sometimes racist, or at least anti-Indigenous, in the sense that even just saying something like that, this is a territory that belongs to, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. There was a time in Canadian sort of discourse where even saying that in most contexts was quite edgy or controversial, and it was very problematic to even say that. So the tradition comes from actually trying to change the narrative and change the story. And I think it's because of that it creates the moments that then turn into the change that we're trying to see. Right? It starts with your mind and it goes into your heart, and then it becomes part of your will to actually do the things. And so, when we started seeing political parties across all the political spectrums do land acknowledgements, on one hand, you're like, okay, they're all just performing now. Does it really mean anything? On the other hand, that now invites a conversation with people across the political spectrum that there's something to latch onto and hold them accountable to, and they have to actually really wrestle with the fact that they're saying those things, and then can really lead to things, or a way to entryway into talking about things in their language or in their ideology. So I would say that, in the context of SFU, there is a lot of work that they're doing with the local First Nations, including Squamish. They recently signed a protocol agreement with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. Squamish has had a protocol agreement with SFU for six years or so. And we continue to work on projects and programs together for our community. So more work to do, of course, but I think there's a lot of positive work also happening behind the scenes.
Question of seniors.
Thank you. No, that's a really important question. I'll answer the how it connects to other sort of documents. So there are a number of sort of international accords or declarations or documents that have found their way within sort of Canadian either legal systems or judicial systems. And so like a good example of this that I learned about recently actually is there's this whole concept, I don't know if people have heard about it, and it's obviously infuriating for at least it's infuriating to me, and you'll find out why in a very quick second, but I'm going to explain it in two parts. So there's this whole concept and this conversation right now happening around parental rights, right? Everybody's hearing about this sort of, I call it a dog whistle thing, in my opinion. But what's interesting about it is I was listening to some Canadian legal experts actually talk about that within Canadian law, as determined by like Supreme Court decisions and decisions by judges, the actual only concept that we have in Canadian law is the rights of children. Like judges have made decisions and laws are made based off the rights of children. And then parents, as I understand it, have an obligation to support the rights of the children and have a fiduciary responsibility, or guardianship responsibility towards the child. So this idea of parental rights doesn't actually really exist within Canadian law. It's just almost like a buzzword, because it's actually the child and the best interests of the child that come into play when there are sort of legal disputes around what should happen in the decision making of a child before they're able to make their own decisions. So there's examples like that where that whole concept of rights of children actually comes from international law, and it comes from international declarations around the rights of children that have then found their way into Canadian law. And then, of course, that ties into some of the Indigenous rights, because there are articles in UNDRIP that speak to the rights of children in that context, where we are now actually developing laws, child welfare laws, like First Nations are, that we define in our own Indigenous legal orders what the rights of children mean, which would include keeping children with their Indigenous families, for example, so that they're not taken out of the community and placed within sort of non-Indigenous homes, like happened in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s for many Indigenous children. So I think that that's where you're seeing things will cross over and connect. And there are articles, I think, in UNDRIP too, that speak to the role of like our knowledge holders and our revered elders and the role that they play within our community and the respect for our elders and the protection of our elders. And there's concepts where we're dealing with it too. We have issues within our communities with like elder abuse, for example, and addressing that. And a lot of that stems to housing unaffordability and income challenges for our elders and as costs rise. So I think that there's a lot of overlap that shows up, and I think that they all become, and this is why I like to call them a tool. Whatever these documents are, they're all different tools, and they either use tools in conjunction with each other, or use tools to do different things, to make things different things possible, and I think that they all work together, and they show up in different ways.
We'll take 3 more questions, and we'll stop after that because we have a reception waiting next door. So please do join us afterwards if you have questions. There's a few back there.
I think mine's a really simple one. I know that we use the word reconciliation a lot, but I know that just over the last, I would say, couple of years, there's been a lot more voices saying you can't have truth without can't have reconciliation without truth. So where do you see, like, does it have to go together, or can reconciliation stand by itself?
I like that question. Thank you. Oh yeah, I keep forgetting. Did 2 more.
Oh, hi there. My name's Ross. I'm the manager of capital planning for street and sidewalk repair for the city of Vancouver. And something that I think about a lot is, the use of these colonial infrastructure and these assets that we maintain. Like every time that my team is repaving a street, in a way we're reinforcing the colonial infrastructure that was laid down to occupy these lands. And so I was wondering if you could maybe give some perspective on ways in which you think colonial infrastructure, literal things like streets, sidewalks, pipes, what have you, ways in which that can be reclaimed to benefit nations, even though that infrastructure that was laid down was never to benefit them, and then ways in which you think infrastructure should actually be removed because it's not serving a benefit.
I think we have one back there.
What is UNDRIP doing to stop TMX, and do you think that TMX can be stopped? And we know this building and this neighborhood, this block, was basically a gentrification project, right? It's like build this block and then go out from there. And this area was, referred to as like the little res, and it did affect a lot of First Nations were out of the area and definitely can't afford to buy anything on the street anymore. So you could talk about that as well, or we can table that for like the second half of the program, but I really would like to know about UNDRIP and what it's doing to stop TMX. Thank you.
Thank you.
Looking forward to the book.
So, yeah, reconciliation. I would say that what I've found to be effective is, like, again, how do you take these concepts and put them into something practical that people can actually then action and do? And so as an example of that, like, and then you build off of it, like it leads into something else, right? So that's not necessarily an answer to say, like, I think that there's necessarily a right or wrong way from an abstract sense. I look at right and wrong as what's effective and what's actually going to get us to where we want to go. So an example of that, one of the things that I actually honestly forgot to mention, and I feel bad for it now that I'm thinking about it because I was kind of working on all my speaking notes today, is the work that I described here, especially the work with the City of Vancouver, would not have been possible without thought leaders and pioneers in this work like Ginger Gosnell-Myers, who is the Indigenous Relations Manager for the City of Vancouver, and was one of the thought leaders with a number of people that created a reconciliation framework that they called it within the City of Vancouver, and it talked about these kind of three quadrants or three spheres that talked about sort of the education, the truth, the education, and the personal understanding, and really then worked for a number of years through the city departments to actually train departments and staff to have them be able to understand the truth, to be educated, and then to understand how it relates to them and their own experiences. All of that work, 3 years of that work, is what laid the groundwork for us then to do the UNDRIP task force and to be able to start talking. Like, I don't think we could have started talking with city officials around land bank from the City of Vancouver or revenue sharing with the City of Vancouver if that first step hadn't been done. And, in speaking to Ginger, like, that was always their intention, was they knew that there had to be some conversational developmental work on the city side before we could get to some of the bigger conversations. And I think it was true. But, you develop a framework like that and then you kind of work your way through it and then it builds into something else. So I think that there's a lot of, if maybe truth is needed first in order to get to the reconciliation piece. And then reconciliation leads to something else. Like, as I kind of pointed out, like, what comes after reconciliation? Well, I think the full enjoyment of Indigenous rights. And there's sort of a step that we can go through. And maybe that, I think it works, and we'll find out. But like I said, I don't think of right and wrong as just morally right and wrong. I think of it as like what's going to be effective. So.
Sidewalks and then TMX
yes,
and the neighborhood.
Thank you. So sidewalks infrastructure, I love this conversation because I am a amateur planning nerd and I love all things urban design and planning and land use and infrastructure. I would say that it's one of those things where there is the truth, and then I think that's a good example where there's acknowledgement of the truth that, okay, yes, a lot of this infrastructure has impeded on Indigenous rights. It has just, damaged the environment, or it's a very foreign system that is replacing our system, and then we're trying to figure out what to do about it. And that gets into the reconciliation of, like, what's the action that we're going to do to resolve this? I think what happens, though, is that the amount of things that could be worked on is massive. Like, there's so many things, and that's a good example of even just thinking about roads or infrastructure or utility infrastructure, things like that. All of it. There's been so many negative impacts, and we don't have the capacity to say we're going to deal with it all at once, or even take it on in a large scale. We can only deal with certain things at a certain time frame, given the capacities that even the nations have. And so that's where we get into things like prioritization. Like, what are the priorities for us around restoring natural environment, or what are the priorities for us around environmental restoration of certain sites that are either culturally significant, environmentally significant, things like that. I start to think, well, like, let's prioritize the things that we want to prioritize, because there's always going to be enough work for us to do, but we can prioritize certain things. And then where I think the opportunities lie too is, UNDRIP and Indigenous rights as a concept are not, it is not a pursuit of nostalgia. Indigenous people in general are not in a pursuit of nostalgia. We're not trying to turn back the hands on the clock and go back to the way things were. That's never really been necessarily the supreme goal. So there are opportunities to say, and UNDRIP speaks to this. UNDRIP says land should be returned, or Indigenous people should be compensated for land that cannot be returned, which is an acknowledgement that some lands might not be returned. Okay, but there are infrastructure that I think maybe it's not going to be undone or replaced or removed or anything, but it actually creates an opportunity, and this is where Indigenous communities are now able to receive the benefit of something that might have otherwise been harmful. So a good example. On the Sanok development, we're doing 6,100 apartments on a 10-acre piece of land near Broad Street Bridge on reserve lands that we reacquired. There is a Metro Vancouver sewage line that runs and bisects it. And so as a result of that opportunity, we are building a district energy system on top of that sewage line. And we're actually going to capture the excess heat that comes off. I didn't know this, but apparently sewage lines cause a lot of heat. And so the excess heat that's going to be generated off that is actually then going to be turned into electricity to power the heating and cooling for the 6,100 apartments, and which will make it the largest carbon neutral housing development project in Canada. Yeah. But it'll also be a business owned by the nation, and so now we are repurposing an infrastructure that was technically in trespass, turning it into this net positive, but that will also generate some cash flow for the nation to be able to support programs and services as well. So that's an example where I think you can make something positive out of it as well. And then TMX, TMX is one of those stories that it's hard for me to talk about for sure, because it's one of those we fought hard and fought long, and I was talking about it with somebody recently that all of the strategies that we had around it, I think they actually would have worked. Like we actually won. We actually won. Like we actually won, except I don't think anybody at the activist level or at the foreign foundation funding of activists in Canada level or the fundraisers that happened here, I don't think anybody at any point thought that the Canadian government would bail out, a liberal government would bail out and nationalize a pipeline project and then spend, at the time it was estimated to be around $6 billion, it's now ballooned to 40. I don't think anybody at the time thought that was on the map of the power structure that we were playing in, and that would be the possibility. So all our strategies, I think, actually led to what we thought was the best desirable outcome, and we actually won that. And then all of a sudden, the chessboard got flipped over, and we were playing a different game, and we weren't prepared for that. So I think, in the context of UNDRIP, I would say if we had the type of legislation we have now, back when UNDRIP or back when TMX was being going through its regulatory process, then I think it probably would have been a different outcome. But that's the challenge, is that we're racing against this sort of thing of things that are right in front of us versus the things that are coming at us over the next decades too. So,
Khelsilem, thank you so much for sharing so generously. It's been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.